All right. So I'm reading this absolutely fantastic old book from Homer for the first time,
Hmm.
which is the Iliad, right? And
Which is
so,
about war, correct?
right, it's way more than that. But the setup is 10 days within the 10-year period of the Trojan War,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And 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 so it's a story about Achilles, and Achilles' fame is kind of connected to his doom. And there's a lot of going on there. And then there's the death of
Yeah.
Patroclus, his cousin, by the hands of Hector. Then
Hmm.
the ultimate fight between Achilles and Hector, and 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 so on and so forth. So the whole thing that Achilles dies, and with the Trojan horse, that is another fragment of another writer of that time that isn't actually part of the Iliad. So it
Hmm.
stops, the Iliad stops with the burial of Patroclus, basically.
Right.
So,
Right.
and it's an interesting thing because it's a little bit weird to read it, because it's like this in this hexagon kind of meter. I needed like 2 days to get into it, but it's a great book. So you have the layer of human affairs, and you have
Hmm.
the layer of the godly affairs. And so the gods are always kind of interfering with the affairs of man, because they have a quarrel with each other, right? And so
Hmm.
what they do is they breathe feelings and moods into people, right? And so that to motivate them to make certain decisions. And so they're interfering all the time. And what's interesting is that it's such an old book. It's nearly 3,000 years old, and therefore like kind of older than the Bible, let's say. That,
Yeah.
these are archetypal forms and action patterns, like in the truest form. And I was thinking, the book starts, also the movie from Wolfgang Petersen, it's very close in terms of dialogue to
Hmm.
to that book, and so you have like this thing where the doom, the glory and the fate of Achilles is tightly connected to his doom. So he has like this kind of thing where his mother Thetis, which is a goddess, says you can
Hmm.
have like an easy life, and you can have kids, and you can be old, and your kids will remember you, and you will be happy, but afterwards the generations will kind of forget you, or you will be glorious and
Or you
famous,
can
and
be
everybody,
famous. Yes. Right.
but you will
Right. Right.
die. And I was
Uh-huh.
like, that's I was always thinking, that's such a true archetype. If you think about Jim Morrison, it's the same thing. It's the
Yeah. The
same
hero has
thing.
to die, right?
Yeah,
In a
and the hero
sense.
has to be driven. The hero has to have a conflict to step out of the mediocrity of life and want something more. But the impetus, the motivation for this is always, now we kind of frame it as a pathology. But it's like
Yeah.
even Achilles had like, no, I can't be in the now. I must strive to be eternal, always
Mm.
infinite, and so there's like this thing, and that's the doom. That thing that
Yeah.
propels him to be special is the same thing that brings death to him. And
It's the
so,
same thing in actually the last temptation of Christ, you know that where Christ is like, oh, you don't have to be on the cross. I don't know if you remember this book and also the movie. You could just have an ordinary life. Just go
right,
in and get married to Mary Magdalene or whatever,
yeah,
and it would be all over. Don't worry about it. And then he, of course, he has to accept his crucifixion and his fate rather than just having an ordinary life. Uh-huh. It has to,
exactly,
yeah, it's about making the ultimate sacrifice in a sense.
exactly. But he's also driven, and that's the interesting thing, because Jim Morrison couldn't could not resist the temptation, because those
Hmm.
people, those archetypes, they can't.
And is there really a temptation, or is it just the fates that are just, is there just a fate that is, that is, it's like an acorn becomes a tree. It's like it's in
Exactly.
within him, and
Yes.
it can only become that. He can only be that, right? That's just why in Greek mythology they talk a lot about the fates, right?
Right.
We don't normally think that way because we have this sort of silly modern illusion that we're in control of our lives and we can make choices and that kind of thing.
Right.
Whereas most of what's happening to us is sort of governed by the gods, really, the fates.
Right.
It's not an arc. It's not an. It's not a. it's not an archaic way of thinking. It's actually true. We're controlled and governed by higher principles and powers and principalities that are directing us in a certain way, and we get possessed by them, and then we have to play out that particular drama. It's not like we are isolated, autonomous, individuals who have a choice, and there's there's no heaven above, no hell below, and there's just like, okay, I'm going to do this, but I think that the ancient way of looking at things was in some ways very much more wise.
You know what's interesting? So when you exactly, because if you read that book, so it's not just the fate of Achilles and something that comes, out of the blue in a kind of way, because it emerges because there are also the whole slew and slate of the other archetypes, right? There's like this beautiful Helena that kind of revels that she brings destruction to everybody, right? Like it's like the narcissistic beautiful woman of today, she's like, oh no, she wreaks havoc in a kind of way. That's Helena. It's like, and she has to fulfill her archetype and her fate. And then you have Hector. It's like the consul of Troya. Troya can't be taken, with him being the consul in a kind of way. And so, but he's like, he doesn't want to step out of his fate. He is not driven. And you have all these figures that are kind of set up in a way that the only authentic way of Achilles to behave is to strive to something more, so his fate and is tightly connected to the fate of everyone else. And because it's such a deep substructure of action patterns and human behavior, it's like it's super interesting to see how the mechanics of all work, because all is set in motion because Paris has to choose between different women, and so he chooses Helena, and so the goddesses are kind of offended by it, and all that sets that kind of the whole
there's an intense interactivity between all the archetypes. They're not isolated at all. Each affects each other. It's sort of fractal, and it's also what is below is above at the same time, and so every action has a sort of a consequence, right?
Right.
Yeah, and who's that Jungian philosopher? James Hillman was always sort of promoting polytheism because he thought in psychology, because he thought it was a more just way of looking at the world than, it's actually not that. It's not that there's a bunch of archetypes, and we can choose which archetype we want to fulfill. It's that the archetypes are choosing us all the time, right? The gods are we don't control the gods. We think we do. This is the illusion, the Promethean illusion of today, is that we kind of control everything, and we're going to be able to, create a utopia with AI and all that. But it's actually that we are at the service and at the mercy of all the archetypes.
Right.
So he thought that he wanted to bring back a polytheism in a sense, to understand the multiplicity of God, right? And it's interesting. Was an interesting theory because there's monotheism, which is like probably invented by the Zoroastrians and the Jews and Christianity, was that this multiplicity is what is ultimately destructive, right? And there's just one God or one overarching principle, and you have to give up all the gods and just there's no other God but Yahweh or whatever. That there's a potential for totalitarianism in that, just as there is a potential for paganism run amok and human sacrifice on the other extreme. So I think we need this sort of a balance between the gods and God, or the divine and the divine attributes.
Right. Now, it's like, again, what I'm thinking, or what I was thinking when I was still reading this book, is this theory about Julian Jaynes again, the theory of the bicameral mind. Because, when you look at this book, one word or two, three kind of words never appear. It's I, me, and mine. It's not part of their vocabulary, at least not in that book. And so Julian Jaynes argued that these kind of words didn't exist. And so the whole notion of I, me, and mine. And his idea was that because there was not such a notion, these voices, that we all have inside of us, that were attributed as the outside, because it's like so weird if the idea that there's a God and that God breathes emotions into you, right? And so it breathes like anger or jealousy or whatever. And so now, and his argument is, we were not evolutionary, not at that point that we had integrated these kinds of voices, but these are deeply internal voices. Now we say, oh no, I'm jealous, I got angry. There's this this intense subjectivity going on.
We subjectivize the gods in a way.
Yeah, and that's his theory. And so if you read it, if you read the Iliad, that makes absolutely sense, because the point is that everybody behaves absolutely childish. Why? Yeah. Because because jealousy, anger, it's not childish in the way that it's something for the children, but it's because it's absolutely unfiltered, right?
Yeah, right.
It's like the first impulse.
Yeah, and then that's very interesting. Yeah, because on the one hand, the ancient people were much more real because they weren't separate from the world, right? From the movements of the gods, right? The movements of jealousy, anger, Mars and Jupiter, and they were embodying those completely. On the other hand, they didn't have this objectivity that they could step outside and look at it and analyze it, and and psychologize and philosophize about it. It was just all happening. And when we learned to psychologize and philosophize, and the more textual we got, the more analytical we got, the more philosophical we got, the more we kind of lost that primordial, state. And then there's a sense that we have to return to it in a way, because if we don't, we become just fragmented postmodern beings who have no connection to the gods, right? And we become sort of random and irrelevant and just arbitrary,
right?
So I think there's a way in which it's like paradise is lost in modernity, and then there's a regaining of there has to be a regaining of that primordiality in order to become fully embodied humans.
Yeah. It's so interesting if you use a metaphor from Peter Sloterdijk with the spheres and the bubbles, So he conceptualizes the world as bubbles and spheres and so on. And so like for them, for these ancient people like 3,000 years ago, if an emotion like anger appeared, or wrath, or something like this, or jealousy, that was the bubble, that was the emergence of a certain goddess that was not well integrated yet. It was like the experiencing subject was somewhat at the margins of it. It's like, there's Mars again, there's Persephone again, and Jupiter and Zeus, and it's like it wasn't yet integrated. And that's that kind of worldview that the emergence of anger was the signal of the God himself. That's the interesting thing,
So have we integrated it today?
If we or I?
No, I mean you said you said we. So the society, we don't have the gods. We're not like praying to. Most people are not, praying to Mars and Jupiter, and or most people don't wake up in the morning and say hello to the god of the sun, or these kind of. We've lost all that because I mean your theory is that we've integrated that, and that's what I'm questioning. I mean, well, because we still have wars and we still have the same kind of behaviors going on.
That's true.
And we're still as irrational as we ever were. We're not. We just don't name them. We don't attach cosmic. We don't mythologize them or attach cosmic significance to them particularly.
Yeah, but isn't that in psychological terms that's just the shadow? When you suppress kind of certain things and then you act them out in a different way. It's like what I mean is like everybody should know that they're kind of responsible for their own feelings. yet we
Yeah.
are kind of sometimes possessed by, you know, egregores or ghouls, or, you know, it's like when a certain collective a manifestation of certain feelings grabs hold of us, you know, it's like, oh no, like what's happening in France right now, the people are upset obviously because of the you know, the age of retirement, but it's still a collective emotion that grabs hold of the people in Paris. No?
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, isn't
Yeah.
that what you're saying, or?
Yeah, well, I'm saying that the gods are still with us. They're just not personified so much, and we tend to, our gods are now psychological, or they're, you know, we talk about drives and things like that, right? We talk about drives and the ego and the superego, and, you know, behaviors as irrational behaviors, and you know, we've analyzed everything to death, right?
Yeah, but
But
the point, as far as I understand what you're saying, and you know, as far as I understand our history, your and mine, about conversations we had on this podcast, and so there is in spiritual traditions, there's always this kind of technique, this meditative technique that you kind of invoke or embody a type of God. You know, it's like the meditation on the God forms, let's say Mercury or Mars. Like you sit into the you get into the meditation, you invoke that kind of God form, and you know, say Mercury, and then you get an in-depth embodiment and feeling what that original archetypal energy means. You know, it's like you have that in your tradition as well.
Yeah, well, the red goddess practices or something like that, like,
Right.
or I don't know, what did Crowley call it, the Scarlet Women, but yeah, so, well, in the Vajrayana tradition, there are these sort of, there's these deity forms, which are which represent what you call a mood or a rasa or a state of being, or something like that, which is, I guess that's similar to, you know, but I want, but on the other hand, they are, let's say, they are a mood or form of not even psychological is too limited, of just nature, or you know, just what it is. So
Are you
I think
familiar?
that I think there's a difference between, let's say, pagan gods, and there's a slight difference here, and that is that it's combined with the sophistication of non-dual philosophy and Buddhism, and that kind of thing. So they're never fully reified as being something that's absolute or in themselves, if that makes any sense.
No, not yet. I don't. Wait, what difference do you talk about? It's like,
Well, I mean, in this society, like, you know, like we don't worship Mercury so much, and, you know, all those gods are kind of dead in some sense. They're alive in literature and mythology and whatever, but
are they? No, it's like what I see is that these archetypal driving forces are still there, because
yeah, they're there.
because
They're always there.
they're literally the foundation of our individual and collective consciousness. That's why the Iliad is such an important book, because you start to understand who you are as a Westerner, right?
Okay.
So these
Well,
forces are still there, because if we engage in rational thinking and argumentation and discourse, then you are ruled by this archetype of Mercury, because these are his kind of qualities.
sure.
But on the other side,
There's an equivalent in the East, which would be Majashri, which would be, or you know, sure, of course.
but on the other side, you have the meditation on the God form, which would be like an occult or spiritual religious practice, where you actually delve into that kind of archetype, and you get an in-depth embodiment and feeling what all these aspects and you know, worldviews of Mercury are. Because if you would meditate about Athene or Persephone or Zeus, the meditation of Zeus is the meditation of the archetype of the father of all fathers, and that is such a weird experiment, because normally I think you can have it when you have a child, right? But then you are a father, but
the father or the mother,
but if you are the father, the truest embodiment of the father archetype, that which is true for every father on earth, which is Zeus, that is such a weird experience if you make these kind of meditation on Zeus. It's it's such a clear representation and embodiment of that feeling, or like Isis or Nuit or whatever. It's like these are God forms that are still true and very powerful, because they guide still our action patterns and our behaviors.
Yeah.
And you have to bring them into the consciousness to really integrate them. That's what I'm saying. Otherwise, you're still driven by them.
Yeah. But well, I guess the difference is that in the Western culture, they're not explicit anywhere anymore. Yeah. Whereas if you go to Nepal or somewhere like that, you'd have statues of Vajrayogini that people would bow down to and worship, or Kali. They go into the temple, and all we have in the West are sort of churches and images of Christ, and so we have the Christian tradition that's sort of taken over everything explicit in the culture. So the images of Manjushri or Vajrayogini or the Malakalas, the fierce Malakalas, and all of these kind of Eastern images in those countries are in India and places like that. They're still there. They're still part of the culture. People still worship them. And I guess Christianity and monotheism would like to wipe that out in some sense. And so it wipes that out. And then, of course, all of these other forces are still there. They're just not part of the explicit culture. So there may be some weird occultist practice like you practice these strange things, but nobody in the general culture does.
Right. Are you familiar with Genpo Roshi?
Yes.
Okay, so he had like a couple of years ago, he was like in everybody's conversation because of his theory about big mind and big heart, And so what he would do, and I saw some videos and read his book, and so there's like this one famous kind of, I think it's a YouTube video or whatever, when he does like a big mind session with a normal journalist, right? And so she was agreeing doing this. And so he would kind of ask, can I speak now? So he was leading her into this. Can I speak to your inner critic? Can I speak to your inner child? Blah, 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 blah. And then he said, and now I would like to talk to big mind. Right? So your inner voice of big mind, right? And suddenly her whole demeanor kind of shifted, and she got, through his way of leading her into that kind of state, she was suddenly in a state of enlightenment, where the boundaries of the ego were kind of transcended, and she was like, oh God, my God, what is happening? And she had like this super awareness for a moment. That's the same thing as invoking a goddess, let's say of Nuit or of Brahman. It's the same thing. It just has a different name, but the technique is the same. The experience is the same.
Yeah, I agree. Sure.
And that's the interesting thing, because if you lead somebody into Brahman, or if you lead somebody into Nuit, it's the same thing as to leading somebody into a sublime state of Samadhi. It's like, these kind of hypnosis, this kind of super awareness.
Well, I guess the Samadhi states don't have a form, or they don't have a structure to them, but whereas these other things are kind of liminal forms, which are between the Samadhi, right? So there's a liminality to the, let's say, the deity forms. They're more like portals, like into something which is sort of timeless and spaceless, and into the Samadhis, right? We talk about the three Samadhis,
they're actually 7 Samadhis, and they
walk. I was talking about in the tradition of the 3 Samadhis in my own particular tradition. So first it's just space, and then there's a luminosity which appears in the space, and then there's a form, and those are those are called the three samadhis. I mean, there's all kinds of different ways of looking at these
but
things.
you're more Buddhist. I'm like more from the. I'm referring more to the Hindu conception, where there are like seven, and they're differentiate. You know, they're going from the more, you know, from the more. What is it called? They moved in
From the non-dual to the more,
yeah, and more into the non-dual, more into the chaotic and luminous kind of thing. You know, it's like the first samadhi is when you, what is the word for that? If you have some, in German you call it Stütze. It's called when you need a mental image as a help to get into that kind of state.
yeah, or it's an icon or something, like it's a
But
portal.
that's just the first. That's just the first samadhi in Hinduism.
Yeah,
And then
sure.
the seventh is just like complete
void, no, you know,
void, non-duality, chaos, all at once and everywhere at the same time.
Sure. I mean, that would be in the Jewish tradition, they call it kether, or, you know, the formless, the ultimate formless state. So you're moving from a more, well, there's the non-duality of the whole thing, right? There's form and the gross forms and the earth and everything that's embodied, and then moving up to non-duality, but then there's a non-duality of the forms and the non-forms at the same time. So there's you can get caught in this sort of reifying the forms. So I think this is one of the problems with like deity practice. If you reify the forms and you forget the non-duality, then you're more in a primitive version of that.
Yeah, but what I was trying to say is that, you know, that in the Semitic kind of traditions you have God forms that kind of overlay with these kind of big love, big mind, super samadhi kind of states. And so while you entering and while you're connecting with the God form, you are kind of leaving the boundaries of the ego kind of behind, you know.
Yeah, I mean, that's why the goddess has a butcher's knife, and she's carrying a bowl of nectar, and she's naked, and she has jewels and you know, made of bones. She's dancing on a sun. All of those things, like, it sounds very mythological and kind of like, you know, cool, and but then each of those symbols have a secondary meaning and a third meaning and a fourth meaning. They all have a particular cosmic, you know, meaning, and then that particular red goddess fits within a mandala of all these other beings, and so it's the whole world, like, you know, the whole it's the whole world represented, you know, in primordial sort of energies, and it's also dynamic and creating itself in every moment, you know. I was thinking about like Osiris, right? Osiris was like imprisoned by his brother Seth, and he was mutilated and dismembered, and, you know, and then he was resuscitated, and all of these, like, and then so he exists in fragments, and it's a metaphor for the spiritual practice where we're trying to put all these fragments together and bring the universe back into a state of, you know, into a symphonic sort of wholeness.
Yeah,
that was waxing poetically quite a bit, but
no, I mean, like, you know, I was going back to the idea of the interconnectedness of the different archetypes, you know. So I was thinking that there was this new interview with Daniel Schmachtenberger, and he was asked one of these kind of bland questions. So what could we do? What could the individual do
what can we do to fix the world?
Yeah. And so he was like kind of saying, oh no, it's like that's such a cringy question, but, you know, it's like the one thing I could that he said that I could recommend is, like, literally try to understand where your opponent or enemy is, like, coming from which kind of worldview, right? It's like we have all these different crises, and on one side, you know, there are the climate deniers, and there are like the climate advocates, and then there are like the people on two sides of, you know, basically everything. And so we are still kind of bound to our perspective without really understanding where the other person is coming from which kind of vantage point, right? And so like, and unless we are not able to do so, we won't heal the world. So
we're stuck in a mono perspective.
Yeah, and so it's like when you look at the Iliad and how all these different archetypes play out, none of them is evil in itself.
Yeah.
Right. If you look at the conflict between Patroclus and Hector and Achilles and Menelaus and Menelaus, Agamemnon, and all of these things, they're not evil. They're just different action patterns, different vantage points, and only by understanding where all these vantage points coming from or where they are, the whole tapestry of life kind of emerges. And so it's like, of course, you know, we can't say that the people that, you know, are critical of the government and the people that are kind of in favor of the actions of the government, that they're evil sides. We're like kind of thrown in this kind of me-you kind of perspective, but there is a valid point to the experience of the other person. It's such a dumb thing to point out, but it's still very true, because you know, all the things going on with the culture war and whatnot, it's just our inability to understand how all these things come together and play out with each other, all these kind of energies and worldviews.
Sure.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, totally. I think something that Daniel said, which I thought was very good, he talked about how every perspective is limited. So we can never get an ultimate perspective of the world. What we do is we put together a lot of different perspectives. So we take a lot of perspectives, and then we get a high dimensional picture of the world. Like if we see a rectangle, right, it looks two-dimensional, and see, that's a rectangle, but actually it might be a cylinder, because, you know, if we look at it in 3 dimensions. So that the rectangle people argue with the circle people because they're living in a flatland 2-dimensional reality, whereas, you know, whereas we have to put a lot of perspectives together to get a dimensional picture of the world. And so we put a lot of fragmented pieces together. Like, I mean, I'm picturing, I was looking at the tarot, all the tarot cards, you just throw them in, and they're all in pieces, but they actually form a whole somehow. They form a whole mandala, right? They form a totality, but we put, and each one in themselves is not a picture of the world, but each one contains a sort of reflection of a picture of the world. And we put all of these different pictures of the world, like putting together Osiris, and then we get a deeper perspective.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So it's not that that's the perspective of truth. It's that it's just a deeper dimension of the real. It's which is a lot of different perspectives put together. So I like to listen to, sometimes I listen to.
It's not just putting different perspectives together. It's the realization that every perspective only gets its vantage point through its position in a tapestry of other perspectives, because that's what the Iliad is about. It's like what you said in the beginning. So the fate of one man is highly dependent of the fate of everybody else, right?
Yeah, it's an Indra's net kind of thing. Everything is reflected within everything else. Yeah.
But it's only constitutional, because if everybody has like the perspectives B, C, D, and E, there has to be somebody who embodies the perspective A, right? And so it's like, and everything plays and belongs together.
Oh, right. So we're back to fates again. It's like people are fated to their own perspective. Like I'm fated to have this particular perspective. I'm looking out of a window into a garden. That's the perspective, and I'm sitting in my little office. That's my perspective, and I can't have your perspective. And so we all have our unique perspective.
But we only have it because other people have their perspective as well. And so that's what I mean. The archetypes are there because there are other archetypes, and it's kind of redundant.
Mm-hmm.
What I mean, it's like the fate of Achilles is only there because Hector has to fulfill his fate, and because Paris has to fulfill his fate. And
So
only
Jordan Peterson is only there because he, sorry to jump, but he only, the right-wing pundits and Jordan Peterson only there because the social justice warriors are there, because
exactly.
you know, all of these, you know, dynamic tensions, you know,
Yeah,
playing
as to
playing off
quote
each other.
Spock, the nature abhorrence the vacuum. It's like
Nature abhors a vacuum.
you can't have one without two. That's what I mean.
Yeah.
You can't have the one without the two. It's like you need the it's like a lock key kind of phenomenon. You know, they both enable each other in a kind of way. And so it's like in the tarot as well, you have 78 cards, and none of this card makes really sense for herself. You need to
In itself,
see it
yeah.
in the context of tarot, or if you shuffle the letters around, of ROTA, which means it goes around, and
Yeah.
it makes, if it's like the fool and the, what is it, the princess of cups, which is the last card. They belong together in because it's the wheel that's spinning around, and you know what I'm saying.
Yeah. It's well, you can map them all out into a big wheel kind of thing. And actually, Jodorowsky makes it into the storm of the swastika, because the swastika is turning. What? You know, I mean, it used to be a symbol of Christ, the swastika.
Yeah.
But
it was the other way around. It was the sun symbol.
Yeah, the sun. It was a symbol of all kinds of, you know, good things at one point, but it's a dynamic wheel. It's not a static cosmos. It's and each card is sort of has something missing in it too, right?
Yeah. Like, you're always coming back to Hitler, Andrew.
We always talk about I'm getting in touch with my inner Hitler.
You're getting in touch with your German side, I feel.
I've been repressing my inner Hitler for so long, and I just need to. I'm not going to do it on, you know, because I could get in trouble. But when we're off, I'll put on some black boots and I'll, you know, march around my garden, and that'll be fine, and I'll be okay after that.
Yeah. No, but it's like, you know, going back, I think there's an idea that it's called individualism, which is like an idea which is roughly 200-300 years old, but it kind of obtuse, is that the word? Like is obtuse a word?
Obtuse, sure.
It kind of obtuses the fact that, you know, our actions is highly dependent and interdependent of the actions of everybody else. You know, so it's a kind of an illusion. It's a surplus of cognitive energy. You know, oh, it's like me, I, me, mine, I do my things, but really you are embedded into culture, into archetypes, into your social networks, and it's like
there's this kind of like mythology about breaking out of the matrix or something, right? Which is a very dualistic point of view, isn't it? Like, okay, we're stuck in this matrix. You have to break out of the matrix and be revolutionaries and become free, like the movie, right?
Right.
But you never break out of the matrix. You just break out of one matrix and find yourself in another matrix.
Right.
Maybe you find yourself in a new and improved matrix. You know, that's possible. But you're never going to break out of the matrix because the matrix is the interdependence of all things, right? It's like, it's the, you know, I guess maybe ultimate enlightenment might be a full escape from the matrix, and that you're no longer bound by the I mean, you're no longer bound by the same laws as the rest of us. Like, you break out of, like, you're like you know, like the fool has no number. He's not even in the number game.
Yeah, well, but I also think
he's the numberless.
I think that's one side. The other side, you know, you're talking about the, you know, that non-dual kind of liberation. But then there's the other side. How do you engage in the world? You know, with what kind of mindset? And I think, like, if you are able to hold the tarot or the ROTA or the Iliad, or if you hold that very basic idea, if you're able to hold that in your mind, that you're not an individual. It's like your fate is dependent on the fate of everybody else, right? And so it's not a singular thing. if you hold the multitude of complex phenomena, if you can hold them in your hand without being attached to certain ideas or memes or fates or whatever, and able to fulfill your fate maybe in the awareness that, well, I have to play that game, right?
Yeah.
Without being too attached.
I was just reading something about Orensov. And
About
it's
what?
in the Jewish tradition. There was a quote from what is it? Oh, I have to find this because I think this is very good. Where is it? Well, it was something about not getting not getting caught up in the multiplicity and remembering the unity or something like that, right? So it says your root of your meditation should be continually bound and unified with everything and soft. Be careful not to cut the shoots thinking about one sephira or another. Rather, your thought should be continually unified with Ein Sof. And there you will spread out and draw down the branch from your thought, the aspect of Yahweh upon which you meditate.
Right.
Sorry, this was anyway, that's pretty esoteric, but the idea is that there's this multiplicity and we can get completely lost in the multiplicity. And the meditation practice is like remembering the unity within the multiplicity. It's not favoring the unity over the multiplicity. It's the non-duality of duality and non-duality, right? It's just so you get caught in all these dramas and how to live in the world and do this and that, and then you come back to the ultimate unicity.
Yeah.
But yeah, you could forget about how to live in the world and just fall into the non-dual state, which would be kind of a psychedelic state, or it would be like you're just lost, right? You're just mentally ill.
Yeah.
And then there's the provisional daily things you have to do to like construct an ego and build run a business and whatever it is.
Yeah.